Captain Simone Wright woke up at 4:30 a.m., her alarm cutting through the quiet darkness of her hotel room. Today was just another workday for her, flying from Chicago to San Francisco. She got ready quickly, her movements practiced after years of early morning flights. As she adjusted her pilot's uniform in the mirror, she took a moment to straighten her captain's bars with pride. At 32, Simone had already broken many barriers. Growing up in a small town outside Atlanta, Georgia, she had fallen in love with flying when her uncle took her to an air show when she was just 8 years old. The way the planes cut through the sky made her heart race with excitement. That day, she told her parents she would become a pilot. They smiled at her dream, not knowing their daughter would fight through every obstacle to make it come true. "Black girls don't become pilots," her high school counselor had once told her. Those words only made Simone work harder. She studied late into the night, earned a scholarship to college, and worked 2 jobs to pay for her first flying lessons. Now, as one of only 43 black female commercial airline pilots in the country, Simone carried the weight of being a pioneer with quiet dignity. The ride to O'Hare International Airport was quick in the early morning hours. Simone nodded to the security staff as she made her way through the terminal. Many recognized her, not just because she was one of the few black female pilots they saw, but because she always took time to greet them by name. "Morning, Captain Wright," called Marco from security. "Clear skies today." "Thanks, Marco. How's your son doing in college?" Simone asked, stopping briefly. "Acing his classes. Thanks for asking." Marco beamed. These small connections mattered to Simone. In a world where she often stood out, building a community gave her strength. At the gate, Simone met with her co-pilot, James Chen. They had flown together many times before and worked well as a team. They walked through their pre-flight checklist with easy efficiency while discussing the weather conditions along their route. "Looks like some light turbulence over the Rockies," James noted, scrolling through the weather report on his tablet. "Nothing we haven't handled before," Simone replied confidently. "Let's make sure we warn the passengers before we hit it." After completing their inspections, Simone took a moment to walk through the cabin, checking that everything was in order. The flight attendants were busy preparing for boarding. Lead flight attendant Miguel Santos gave her a quick thumbs up. "All set, Captain. We're expecting a full flight today." "Thanks, Miguel. Let's give them a smooth ride," Simone said with a smile. When boarding began, Simone stood at the cockpit door, greeting passengers as they entered. This was something she always did, believing that letting passengers see the person responsible for their safety built trust. Most passengers smiled or nodded as they passed. Some children looked at her with wide eyes, not used to seeing a female pilot, much less a black one. Simone always gave these children special attention, knowing that seeing her might plant a seed of possibility in their minds. "Are you really the pilot?" a little girl with braids asked, stopping in front of Simone. "I sure am. I'm Captain Wright," Simone replied, kneeling to the girl's level. "I want to be a pilot too," the girl exclaimed. "Then study hard in school, especially math and science. The sky will be waiting for you," Simone told her with a wink. The girl's mother thanked Simone with a meaningful look that said more than words could. The boarding continued smoothly until a well-dressed middle-aged white woman stopped abruptly at the sight of Simone. The woman, Patricia Knowles, as they would later learn from her boarding pass, looked Simone up and down with narrowed eyes. "Is this some kind of joke?" Patricia asked loudly, her voice cutting through the pleasant hum of boarding passengers. "Where is the real pilot?" The nearby passengers fell silent. Miguel, who was helping an elderly passenger with her bag, turned to look at the commotion. Simone had faced moments like this before. She kept her professional smile firmly in place, though it no longer reached her eyes. "Good morning, ma'am. I'm Captain Wright. I'll be commanding this flight to San Francisco today," Simone said evenly. Patricia scoffed, clutching her designer purse tighter. "I need to speak to someone in charge. I'm not getting on a plane flown by, well, I just want someone qualified." The implication hung in the air, heavy and unmistakable. This was just the beginning of what would become an unforgettable flight for everyone on board Flight 1382 to San Francisco. The tension in the airplane cabin grew thick as Patricia Knowles stood firmly in the aisle, blocking other passengers trying to board. Her face was twisted in disapproval as she stared at Captain Simone Wright. I want to speak to the manager or whoever is in charge, Patricia demanded, raising her voice. There must be some mistake. Miguel, the lead flight attendant, stepped forward with a calm but serious expression. At 45, he had seen his share of difficult passengers, but the open disrespect toward Captain Wright made his jaw tighten. Ma'am, Captain Wright is the pilot in command of this aircraft. She is highly qualified with over 8,000 flight hours. Now please take your seat so we can continue boarding, Miguel said firmly. Patricia shook her head, her blonde hair swinging with the movement. No, this is ridiculous. I need to see her credentials. How do we know she's even trained properly? By now, several passengers had stopped to watch the scene unfold. Some looked uncomfortable, others angry, and a few had already taken out their phones, ready to record if things escalated. I can assure you, Simone said, maintaining her professional tone despite the insult, I graduated top of my class from Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University and have been flying with this airline for 7 years. Patricia snorted. We all know how you probably got this job. A collective gasp went through the passengers in hearing range. An older man in seat 3C shook his head in disgust. James Chen, Simone's co-pilot, had stepped out of the cockpit when he heard the commotion. He was about to intervene when a tall black man in a business suit spoke up from the boarding line. Excuse me, he said, his deep voice carrying easily across the cabin. I'm Dr. Marcus Johnson, and I've flown over 2 million miles. I trust Captain Wright with my life, as I've had the pleasure of flying with her before. Perhaps the person who should be questioned about their qualifications is you, ma'am, qualified to be a decent human being, that is. Several passengers clapped and nodded in agreement. Patricia's face flushed red, but she wasn't backing down. I'm just concerned for safety, she insisted, pulling out her phone. I'm going to record this and post it online. People should know what kind of pilots this airline is hiring these days. Miguel stepped closer. Ma'am, recording crew members without permission is against airline policy. You have 2 options right now. Take your seat or deplane. What's it going to be? Patricia looked around, seemingly surprised that no one was taking her side. Her eyes landed on an older white woman who was watching the scene with a frown. Can you believe this? Patricia asked her, seeking an ally. The older woman, who was wearing a NASA cap, slowly stood up. Actually, I can't believe your behavior. I'm Dr. Helen Carter. I trained astronauts for 30 years at NASA, and I can tell you that qualifications have nothing to do with gender or race. Your ignorance is showing, dear. More passengers applauded. Patricia's face grew even redder, but suddenly her expression changed. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small pill bottle with shaking hands. I need my medication, she stuttered. I have anxiety about flying. Miguel's face softened slightly. Would you like some water to take your medication? After that, I need you to take your seat quietly, or we'll have to ask you to leave the aircraft. As Patricia fumbled with her pill bottle, Simone made a quick decision. She approached the woman calmly. Miss Knowles, she said, having noted the name from the boarding pass, flying can be stressful. I understand that. If you'd like, after you take your medication and get settled, I'd be happy to show you my credentials and answer any questions about my training. Safety is my top priority, too. The unexpected kindness seemed to throw Patricia off balance. She looked at Simone with confusion, as if seeing her for the first time. I just... Patricia stammered, then swallowed her pill with the water Miguel had brought. Fine, I'll take my seat. As Patricia moved toward her assigned seat, the other passengers began to board again. Some gave Simone supportive nods or quiet words of encouragement as they passed. Back in the cockpit, James placed a hand on Simone's shoulder. You handled that with incredible grace. I would have lost my cool. Simone took a deep breath. It's not the first time, and it won't be the last. Let's just focus on giving everyone a safe flight. But as she sat in the captain's chair and began her final preparations, Simone couldn't help wondering what would happen when they reached cruising altitude. Would Patricia cause more problems? Would she need to divert the flight? Or would this be a teaching moment for everyone involved? Little did Simone know, this flight was about to become much more memorable than she could have imagined. The Boeing 737 pushed back from the gate right on schedule. Captain Simone Wright's voice came over the intercom, clear and professional as she welcomed everyone aboard and gave the standard flight information. Most passengers settled in comfortably, but in seat 14C, Patricia Knowles stiffened at the sound of Simone's voice. "This is Captain Wright speaking. We're expecting a smooth flight to San Francisco today with just a bit of turbulence as we cross the Rockies. Our flying time will be approximately 4 hours and 20 minutes. The weather in San Francisco is sunny with a high of 68 degrees. We'll be taking off shortly. Thank you for flying with us today." Patricia muttered something under her breath and gripped her armrests tightly. The middle-aged businessman in 14B glanced at her nervously before turning back to his laptop. Once they reached cruising altitude, Miguel and the other flight attendants began the drink service. When they reached Patricia's row, she was visibly agitated. "I need to speak with the pilot," Patricia demanded loudly. Miguel leaned in closer and lowered his voice. "Miss Knowles, Captain Wright is flying the plane right now. Is there something I can help you with?" "No, I want to see her credentials," Patricia insisted. "I looked her up online while we were waiting to take off, and I couldn't find much information. That seems suspicious to me." The passenger across the aisle, a young woman with bright blue hair, rolled her eyes dramatically. "Maybe you should just be grateful we're safely in the air instead of harassing the pilot." Patricia turned to her. "You don't understand. This is about safety. What if she only got this job because of, diversity requirements?" The blue-haired woman removed her earbuds completely. "You mean, what if she's actually highly qualified and black? Because that's what's happening here." Miguel intervened before the situation could escalate. "Miss Knowles, would you like something to drink? We have water, soda, juice." "I'll have a vodka tonic. Make it a double," Patricia said sharply. Miguel hesitated. "I'm sorry, but given your earlier mention of anxiety medication, I don't think alcohol would be advisable." Patricia's face flushed with anger. "Are you a doctor now, too? First a black woman flying the plane, and now you're refusing me service?" The commotion was drawing attention from nearby rows. An older gentleman across the aisle leaned forward. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being listened to. "I couldn't help overhearing. I'm Dr. William Thompson, retired chief of surgery at Chicago Memorial." Patricia looked at him expectantly, seemingly hoping for support. Medical professional to concerned citizen, Dr. Thompson continued, "Mixing anxiety medication with alcohol is dangerous. The flight attendant is correct to deny you service." Patricia's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Before she could respond, the plane suddenly dropped and shuddered as they hit a patch of turbulence. Several passengers gasped. Patricia let out a small scream. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Wright," came Simone's steady voice over the intercom. "We've hit some expected turbulence. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts. Flight attendants, please pause service and be seated." The turbulence continued for several minutes. Throughout it all, Patricia gripped her armrests so tightly her knuckles turned white. When the plane finally smoothed out, she was visibly shaken. Miguel, who had strapped into the nearby jump seat, noticed Patricia's distress. Once the seatbelt sign turned off, he approached her again. "Are you all right, Miss Knowles?" he asked with genuine concern. Patricia nodded stiffly, her earlier hostility somewhat diminished by fear. "That was some rough air," Miguel acknowledged. "But Captain Wright handled it perfectly. She actually specialized in turbulence management during her advanced training." Patricia said nothing, still trying to compose herself. From the row behind Patricia, a young girl of about 8 peered over the seat. "That was scary. But the pilot lady is really good, isn't she? My mom says she's a hero because not many girls like us become pilots." Patricia turned to see a young black girl with braided hair and bright, intelligent eyes. The girl's mother, seated next to her, gave Patricia a level gaze that seemed to dare her to say something inappropriate in front of her daughter. The moment was interrupted when the cockpit door opened, and First Officer James Chen stepped out, heading toward the lavatory. As he passed Patricia's row, he paused. "Everything okay back here, Miguel?" he asked, his eyes flicking briefly to Patricia. "All good, thanks," Miguel replied. James nodded and continued on his way, but not before Patricia called out to him. "Excuse me," she said, her voice smaller than before. About halfway through the flight, the cabin had settled into a peaceful rhythm. Most passengers were watching movies, reading, or napping. Patricia Knowles sat quietly in her seat, occasionally glancing toward the cockpit door. The earlier confrontation seemed to have left her subdued. Miguel passed through the cabin, checking on passengers. When he reached Patricia's row, he was surprised when she raised her hand slightly to get his attention. "Excuse me," Patricia said, her voice much softer than before. "I was wondering, is it possible to speak with Captain Wright after we land? Just for a few minutes." Miguel studied her face, looking for signs of hostility, but saw only uncertainty and perhaps a touch of shame. "I can ask her," he replied carefully, "but I can't promise anything. Captain Wright has post-flight duties to attend to." Patricia nodded. "I understand. Thank you." As Miguel continued down the aisle, the plane suddenly jolted. It wasn't turbulence this time. The movement was more abrupt, followed by a strange noise from the right side of the aircraft. The cabin lights flickered once, then stabilized. Gasps and worried murmurs spread through the cabin. A baby started crying somewhere in the back. Patricia's hands immediately gripped her armrests again, her knuckles white with tension. The intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is First Officer Chen speaking. We've experienced a minor electrical issue that's now resolved. There's no cause for concern, but as a precaution, we ask all passengers to remain seated with seatbelts fastened. Thank you for your cooperation." The message was delivered calmly, but several passengers exchanged worried glances. The young girl who had spoken to Patricia earlier now looked frightened. Her mother held her hand, whispering reassurances. "Is the plane going to crash?" the girl asked, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. Patricia turned around in her seat and looked at the child. For a moment, she hesitated, then spoke in a surprisingly gentle tone. "No, sweetie. These planes are built to handle much bigger problems than this. The pilots know exactly what they're doing." The mother looked at Patricia with surprise, then gave her a small nod of thanks. About 10 minutes passed with mounting tension in the cabin. Some passengers were checking their phones, as if hoping for a signal despite being at 35,000 feet. Others were whispering to each other, speculating about the electrical issue. Then the cockpit door opened, and Captain Simon Wright emerged. A wave of whispers swept through the cabin as she moved with confident steps down the aisle. She stopped in the middle of the main cabin where everyone could see her. "Good afternoon, everyone," Simon said, her voice strong and reassuring. "I wanted to come out personally to let you know that we had a minor electrical glitch with one of our redundant systems. The primary systems are functioning perfectly, and we've already notified our maintenance team in San Francisco to check things over when we land." She smiled warmly. "Commercial aircraft like ours have multiple backup systems for every critical function. What you experienced was actually the automatic switch to a backup system. That's the sound and movement you felt. The system worked exactly as designed." A passenger raised his hand. "Should we be worried?" "Not at all," Simon replied confidently. "If I had any concerns about safety, we would be diverting to the nearest airport. We're continuing to San Francisco because there is absolutely no safety risk. We'll be landing on schedule in about 2 hours." Patricia watched Captain Wright closely during this explanation. For the first time, she seemed to be seeing beyond her preconceptions, noting the calm authority and expertise with which Simon addressed the situation. As Simon finished answering a few more passenger questions, her eyes briefly met Patricia's. Something passed between them, not exactly forgiveness, but perhaps understanding. Patricia lowered her gaze first. Before returning to the cockpit, Simon stopped to speak with the young girl who had been frightened. She knelt down to eye level with the child. "What's your name?" Simon asked with a gentle smile. "Jasmine," the girl replied shyly. "Well, Jasmine, did you know that flying is the safest way to travel? Safer than cars or trains or even walking?" Jasmine giggled. "Really?" "Really," Simon confirmed. "And when you grow up, if you want to be a pilot too, I think you'd be excellent at it." Jasmine beamed with pride. "I do want to be a pilot, just like you." As Simon stood up, her eyes once again met Patricia's. This time, Patricia didn't look away. Instead, she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod that acknowledged something had changed in her thinking. When Simon returned to the cockpit, Miguel approached Patricia. The landing at San Francisco International Airport was smooth as silk. Captain Simon Wright guided the Boeing 737 down onto the runway with such precision that many passengers commented on it as they gathered their belongings. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to San Francisco. Local time is 11:42 a.m. and the temperature is 70 degrees with clear skies. Please remain seated with seatbelts fastened until we reach the gate and the seatbelt sign has been turned off, Simon announced over the intercom. As the aircraft taxied to the gate, Patricia Knowles sat nervously in her seat. She had spent the last hour of the flight in quiet reflection, occasionally glancing at the young girl named Jasmine who wanted to be a pilot. The girl had drawn a picture of an airplane with a stick figure in the cockpit wearing what looked like a captain's hat. The crayon creation was labeled "Made in the Future" in wobbly handwriting. When the plane finally came to a stop at the gate and the seatbelt sign turned off, passengers stood up and began the usual rush to retrieve bags from overhead bins. Patricia remained seated, letting others go ahead of her. Miguel, the lead flight attendant, approached her seat. "Miss Knowles, if you'd like to wait until most passengers have deplaned, Captain Wright will meet you here." Patricia nodded, her hands fidgeting with the strap of her purse. "Thank you." As the last few passengers made their way out, Jasmine and her mother passed by Patricia's row. The little girl stopped. "Look at my picture," Jasmine said proudly, holding up her drawing for Patricia to see. "I'm going to be a pilot just like Captain Wright." Patricia smiled softly. "It's a wonderful picture. I think you'll be an excellent pilot." Jasmine beamed before her mother gently guided her toward the exit, giving Patricia a small, appreciative nod as they left. Soon the cabin was empty except for Patricia and the flight crew, who were completing their post-flight duties. The cockpit door opened, and Captain Simon Wright emerged. Without her captain's hat, her short natural hair was visible, framing a face that showed signs of both strength and fatigue. She walked down the aisle and stopped at Patricia's row. "Miss Knowles," Simon said with a professional nod. "I understand you wanted to speak with me." Patricia stood up awkwardly, suddenly unsure of what to say now that the moment had arrived. "Yes, thank you for taking the time." Simon gestured to an empty row of seats. "Let's sit for a moment. My first officer is finishing up the logbook." They sat across the aisle from each other. Patricia took a deep breath. "I owe you an apology," she began, her voice slightly shaky. "My behavior earlier was inexcusable." Simon's expression remained neutral, but she nodded for Patricia to continue. I hadn't seen a black woman as a pilot before, and Patricia struggled to find the right words. "I made assumptions that were wrong. The way you handled that electrical issue showed me how wrong I was." Simon studied Patricia for a moment before responding. "Can I ask you something, Miss Knowles?" Patricia nodded, looking nervous. "If I had been a white male pilot, would you have questioned my qualifications?" The blunt question hung in the air between them. Patricia's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "No," she admitted quietly, "I wouldn't have." "That's called implicit bias," Simon said, her tone not accusatory but matter-of-fact. "We all have it in some form. The question is what we do when we recognize it in ourselves." Patricia nodded, looking down at her hands. "I've never thought of myself as prejudiced. I have black colleagues. I've donated to charities that help minority communities. But seeing me in the cockpit challenged something in your worldview," Simon finished for her. "Yes," Patricia admitted. Simon leaned forward slightly. "Do you know that less than 1% of commercial airline pilots are black women? When I was training, I had instructors who treated me differently, passengers who refused to board, and colleagues who assumed I got the job because of affirmative action." Patricia winced at the mention of affirmative action, remembering her own accusation earlier. "Every day," Simon continued, "I have to be better than good. I have to be exceptional, because people like you are watching, waiting for me to make a mistake that confirms their bias." "I'm truly sorry," Patricia said, tears forming in her eyes. "What happened today? It made me see something ugly in myself that I didn't know was there." Simon's expression softened slightly. "Recognition is the first step to change." Patricia wiped away a tear. "That little girl, Jasmine, seeing how she looked at you, how inspired she was, I realized I was the kind of person who might have crushed her dreams with my attitude." Simon nodded. "Flying this plane isn't just my job." 3 weeks after the flight, Simone Wright sat in a small coffee shop near her apartment in Chicago. It was her day off, and she was enjoying the simple pleasure of reading a book without the pressure of a flight schedule. The autumn sun streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow over the busy cafe. Simone looked up briefly when the bell above the door jingled as someone entered. She froze, coffee cup halfway to her lips, when she recognized the customer who had just walked in. Patricia Knowles was scanning the cafe, apparently looking for someone. She was dressed casually in jeans and a blue sweater, very different from the business attire she had worn on the flight. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she carried a large tote bag over her shoulder. Before Simone could decide whether to acknowledge her or pretend not to notice, Patricia's eyes landed on her. There was a moment of surprise, then recognition. Patricia hesitated before walking over to Simone's table. "Captain Wright," she said, her voice uncertain. "What a coincidence." Simone nodded politely. "Miss Knowles, I didn't expect to see you in Chicago. I live here," Patricia explained. "That day, I was flying back from a business trip." She gestured to the empty chair across from Simone. "May I?" After a brief hesitation, Simone nodded. Patricia sat down, placing her tote bag on the floor beside her. "I've been thinking a lot about our conversation," Patricia said, fidgeting with a paper napkin on the table. "I couldn't stop thinking about it, actually." Simone remained quiet, giving Patricia space to continue. "I've started reading some books," Patricia said, reaching into her tote bag. She pulled out 3 books with bookmarks sticking out from their pages. The titles included White Fragility, Biased, and The New Jim Crow. "I'm trying to understand," Patricia continued, "the things you said about implicit bias. I've been doing a lot of soul searching." Simone looked at the books, genuinely surprised by Patricia's efforts. "That's commendable." Patricia shook her head. "Don't give me too much credit yet. I just started this journey. But I wanted to tell you something." She took a deep breath before continuing. "I work in HR for a large company. After our flight, I went back and reviewed our hiring practices. I realized we had systems in place that might be limiting diversity without us even realizing it." Simone raised her eyebrows, intrigued. "How so?" "We were recruiting from the same 3 universities for our technical positions. When I looked at the demographics of those schools, I realized we were drawing from a pool that was predominantly white and male," Patricia had explained. "So I proposed expanding our recruitment to include more diverse institutions." "And how did that go over?" Simone asked. "There was pushback," Patricia admitted. "Some colleagues made the same arguments I might have made a month ago about lowering standards or forced diversity. But I stood my ground. I showed them the data on how diverse teams perform better." A small smile formed on Simone's lips. "That couldn't have been easy." "It wasn't," Patricia agreed. "But every time I felt myself wavering, I thought about that little girl on the plane, Jasmine. I thought about what you said, about being that statement that shows girls like her what's possible." Patricia paused, then continued with more emotion in her voice. "And I thought about all the times in my career when people assumed I got ahead because I was attractive, not competent. How angry that made me. Yet I did the exact same thing to you, based on race instead of gender." Simone nodded slowly, taking a sip of her coffee. "It's not easy to confront these things in ourselves." "No, it's not," Patricia agreed. "But I'm trying. My company is hosting a diversity and inclusion workshop next month, and I volunteered to help organize it." She reached into her bag again and pulled out a business card, sliding it across the table to Simone. "I was wondering, would you consider being a speaker? Your story is powerful. It might help others understand in a way that books and statistics can't." Simone picked up the card, studying it thoughtfully. "I need to check my flight schedule." "Of course," Patricia said quickly. "And I completely understand if you're not interested. You don't owe me, or my company, anything." Simone tucked the card into her book as a bookmark. "I'll think about it. I can't promise anything, but I'll consider it." Patricia nodded, looking relieved. "That's all I can ask." She stood up, gathering her books. "I should go. I'm meeting my book club. We're discussing Biased this week." As Patricia prepared to leave, Simone called after her. "Miss Knowles." Patricia turned back. "What you're doing, the self-reflection, the actions at your company, it matters. Simone said sincerely. It's how change happens. 2 months after their chance meeting at the coffee shop, Captain Simone Wright stood at a podium in the conference room of Patricia's company. Behind her was a large screen showing a photo of her standing proudly next to her aircraft. The room was filled with about 50 employees, all watching her with interest. Fear often disguises itself as something else, Simone was saying, as anger, as doubt, as judgment. When Miss Knowles questioned my abilities that day on the flight, what she was really expressing was fear. Patricia sat in the front row, nodding slightly. She looked different now, more relaxed, more open. The tight-lipped woman from the flight was gone. I understand fear, Simon continued. Every pilot does. We're trained to manage it, to use it as information rather than letting it control us. But the kind of fear I'm talking about today is different. It's the fear of change, the fear of seeing someone in a role that challenges your expectations. Simon clicked to the next slide, which showed a striking statistic. Out of approximately 14,000 commercial pilots in the United States, fewer than 150 were black women. This number hasn't changed much in the last decade, Simon explained. And one reason is the everyday barriers created by assumptions and biases. From the back of the room, a hand went up. A middle-aged white man in a button-down shirt asked, "Don't you think things are getting better, though? I mean, you made it." Simone smiled patiently. I did. And yes, things are improving. But making it often means working twice as hard to be considered half as good. It means having perfect performance records because any mistake will be attributed to your gender or race, not just to being human. Patricia stood up. If I may add something, she said, looking around at her colleagues. Before my experience with Captain Wright, I would have asked the same question. I thought I was progressive, open-minded. But when faced with a black woman in authority, literally holding my life in her hands, my implicit biases surfaced in ugly ways. The room was silent as Patricia continued. The truth is, I was comfortable with diversity in theory, but uncomfortable when it challenged my assumptions about who should be in charge. Another employee raised her hand. How did you move past it? Beyond just feeling guilty, I mean. Patricia looked at Simone, who nodded encouragingly. It started with acknowledging it, Patricia explained, not making excuses or getting defensive. Then I educated myself and, most importantly, I took action. She gestured around the room. This workshop is part of that action, but so are the changes we've made to our hiring practices, which have already increased our candidate diversity by 30%. Simon returned to her presentation, sharing stories from her career, the flight instructor who refused to teach her, the passengers who requested different flights, the colleagues who made jokes about affirmative action. But I also want to share the positive stories, she said, clicking to a new slide showing Jasmine, the little girl from the flight, smiling widely in a photo taken in the cockpit. This is why representation matters. This is why I stay in the cockpit despite the challenges. After the presentation ended and people began mingling over coffee and snacks, Simon found herself surrounded by employees asking questions and sharing their own experiences. Patricia watched from a distance, giving Simone space to connect with the group. Later, as the room emptied, Patricia approached Simone with 2 cups of coffee. That was powerful, Patricia said, handing Simone a cup. You had them completely engaged. Simone accepted the coffee with a smile. Your part was pretty powerful, too. It takes courage to be so honest about your own biases in front of your colleagues. Patricia shrugged. It gets easier each time. And honestly, it's been liberating. Once I admitted my biases, I could actually work on them instead of pretending they didn't exist. They sat down at a small table in the corner of the room. I have something to show you, Patricia said, pulling out her phone. She opened her email and showed Simone a message from HR. We've implemented those recruitment changes I told you about. Next month, we'll be attending career fairs at 5 historically black colleges and universities. Simon's face lit up. That's fantastic, Patricia. And there's more, Patricia continued excitedly. We're starting an internship program specifically for students from underrepresented groups in aviation and aerospace engineering. That's how real change happens, Simon said, clearly impressed. Not just conversations, but concrete actions. Patricia nodded, then hesitated before speaking again. I've been thinking about what you said on the plane, about being exceptional because people are waiting for you to fail. That burden shouldn't be on you or anyone else. 1 year after the flight that changed 2 lives, Simon Wright stood in the spacious auditorium of West Side High School in Chicago. The room was filled with teenage girls, their faces bright with curiosity and possibility. This was the first annual Wings for Girls Aviation Career Day, an event co-founded by Simone and, surprisingly, Patricia Knowles. Who here has ever been told they couldn't do something because of who they are? Simone asked the audience. Almost every hand went up. Simone nodded, unsurprised. I was told the same thing, that black women don't become pilots, that the cockpit wasn't my place. She paused, looking around the room. But here I am, with over 10,000 flight hours as a commercial airline captain. From the side of the stage, Patricia watched with pride. In the past year, their unlikely friendship had blossomed into a powerful partnership. Patricia had left her corporate HR job to start a nonprofit focused on increasing diversity in aviation and other technical fields. Simone served on the board and spoke at events whenever her flight schedule allowed. And now, Simon continued, I'd like to introduce someone very special, a person whose story is different from mine, but just as important. Please welcome Patricia Knowles, founder of Changing Course Foundation. Patricia walked onto the stage, smiling warmly at the students. She no longer resembled the tense, angry woman from that fateful flight. There was an openness to her face now, a genuine warmth that hadn't been there before. My journey is not about being told I couldn't do something, Patricia began honestly. It's about realizing I was the person doing the telling. I was the barrier standing in someone else's way. She went on to share her story, how her confrontation with Simone had forced her to recognize her own biases and how that recognition had ultimately changed the direction of her life. Change isn't comfortable, Patricia told the girls. It means admitting when you're wrong. It means looking at ugly parts of yourself you'd rather ignore. But on the other side of that discomfort is growth. After their presentations, Simone and Patricia led the girls outside where a small private plane was waiting. The school had received special permission to use the football field as a temporary landing strip for the event. The girls crowded around excitedly as Simone explained the basic principles of flight. And now for the really exciting part, Simone announced. 10 of you will get to take a short flight with me today. The cheers were deafening. Names were drawn from a bowl, and the lucky winners could barely contain their excitement. Among them was a quiet girl named Maya, who had barely spoken all day but whose eyes lit up when her name was called. As the first group prepared to board the plane, Patricia noticed Maya hanging back nervously. Everything okay? Patricia asked gently. Maya shook her head. I've never been on a plane before. I'm scared. Patricia knelt down to eye level with the teenager. Can I tell you a secret? I used to be terrified of flying too. Really? Maya looked skeptical. But you work with pilots. Patricia smiled. Sometimes the things that scare us the most become the things that change our lives the most. I met Captain Wright because I was afraid, not just of flying, but of seeing someone like her in charge. Maya considered this. And now you're friends. More than friends. We're partners in changing the world a little bit at a time, Patricia replied. So what do you say? Ready to face that fear? Slowly, Maya nodded. Patricia walked her to the plane where Simone was helping the other girls get settled. One more brave aviator joining us, Patricia announced. Simone smiled at Maya. Perfect timing. I need a co-pilot for this flight. How about it? Maya's eyes widened. Me? Absolutely you, Simone confirmed, helping her into the front seat. As Patricia watched the small plane take off, she felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned to find Jasmine, the little girl from the original flight, now a year older, standing there with her mother. Miss Patricia, Jasmine exclaimed. Mom said we might see you here. Patricia beamed at seeing the girl again. Jasmine, you've grown so much. Jasmine's mother smiled. After meeting Captain Wright on that flight, Jasmine wouldn't stop talking about becoming a pilot. When we saw this event advertised, we had to come. I've been studying math really hard, Jasmine announced proudly. Captain Wright said it's important for pilots. She's right about that, Patricia agreed. And speaking of Captain Wright, look up there. She pointed to the small plane circling above them. She'll be back down soon if you want to say hello." As they all watched the plane soar through the clear blue sky, Patricia reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that had led to this moment.